Welcome to the Silver Screen Guide podcast, where we discuss films from every genre. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the podcast. Welcome back, listeners, to the final installment for now of our Halloween retrospective series. This has been a long time coming, about 11 months, because the very first episode was a Halloween special, about 2-ish years ago now, maybe 3. So this is the 2018 Halloween, not the 1978 Halloween or the Rob Zombie Halloween. This is just Halloween. I don't know why they decided to call it that, but
yeah, we'll have to talk about that title a little bit because I have some things to say.
Oh, okay. I don't got a bone to pick with it apparently, but this is your co-host Corbin.
I'm Helen from Chicago.
And we have been chronicling the development of this Halloween movie on Silver Screen Guide for about 2 years now. You can go back in the archives. We're talking about who's coming on board, the announcements and stuff. So I've been pretty excited for this movie. And honestly, I haven't really been excited for any movie this much in a long time. I really wanted this to be a special experience. And the first Halloween is really personal to me, actually. John Carpenter's direction, cinematography, story, score, and most of all, atmosphere that he created in that film. It's the perfect horror film to me. And it's also very nostalgic for me. And still scary to me even to this day. So, in even the name, I have to talk about the name because the name Halloween just became so menacing and had this terrifying prowess that the holiday took on like a whole new meaning for me. And I remember every year the AMC TV channel would advertise the movies, and I was always so curious, but too scared to watch them, also not allowed to watch them, until one year I was old enough, and I was a young teenager, and I watched them, and I just fell in love with the series ever since. So that's why, a little bit of background as to why this movie means a lot to me coming out, to have a Halloween movie that's actually hopefully really solid and not just terrible.
Right. And I've of course heard of Halloween, but up until whenever we reviewed it a couple of years ago, I had never seen it. I mean, I knew the theme, I knew about Michael Myers, I knew all that kind of stuff, but I just never actually sat down to watch the actual movie until we reviewed it. And I remember in the podcast, I gave it a really high score, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I've been meaning to pick it up on Blu-ray, but I haven't yet. But I did get to rewatch it yesterday night of this recording, so I got to watch it yesterday. And it had been the first time that I rewatched it since we had reviewed it, and I still remember absolutely loving it. Everything that I said in that review pretty much still holds up to this day. I remember really, really enjoying it and still being scared because this movie does a really good job at portraying Michael Myers as this very menacing force. And so I did watch this movie. I watched the original Halloween after I had seen the new one. And this has just been kind of interesting to me because I too have been kind of wanting a at least decent Halloween movie since the first one. They've all been either somewhat decent or terrible. More of them are terrible than they are decent. And to be fair, I mean, you have the nostalgic factor going to see this movie. I don't. I'm pretty new to the series in like just a couple of years. And so I was kind of excited for this new one because I knew that John Carpenter was coming back to do a lot of things. But at the same time, I was just kind of skeptical because we've had so much schlock in terms of Halloween movies over the years that I was just like, yeah, but do we need to bring the series back again for a third time?
Oh, that's completely understandable because, yes, this is the third Halloween movie. It's been rebooted technically almost more times than you can count, but I did count them, right. And I created a mega timeline of what I counted was 8 different canon timelines you could technically branch off from the original movie. So go ahead and check that out in the archives if you are confused about where this movie is placed. Go ahead and check that out. It's pretty easy to find. But yeah, coming into the theater, I wanted to have a really good experience, and I guess I did for the most part because I got to show I got to introduce my sister to the Halloween series for the first time. She had never seen a movie before, nice. A Halloween movie before. She hadn't seen the first one. And I said, I don't really think you'll be confused coming into this one. And she wasn't. She was absolutely terrified. And so that was kind of fun to experience that with her. And I think this was probably... I do think this was a good way for her to come into the series, especially theatrically. So I was really that was a fun moment to share between the siblings. But a 6-year-old was sitting behind me, and he thought he would want to talk the whole movie, and his mom kind of let him, but then she'd kind of tell him to be quiet. And then I think he had this coping mechanism of grunting every 30 seconds because he was scared. And then these odd people came and sat on a row, and they were kind of talking kind of loudly. So the guy in front of us told them to be quiet. And it was kind of a funny experience in that aspect. And I mean, I was still able to pay attention, of course, but some elements I would have liked to have been able to focus a little better without a 6-year-old grunting and the odd couple being odd, essentially.
Right. And I had a somewhat interesting experience with mine. My audience was just kind of a bit louder than normal, than what I guess I'm used to. The Midwest is usually generally pretty quiet when it comes to watching movies, but there are some exceptions. This is kind of one of them. It wasn't like, I wouldn't say my experience was bad. It just, I guess, wasn't what I was expecting. It was, people were just kind of overly loud, and they laughed at moments they probably shouldn't have. I guess that they wasn't supposed to laugh at in terms of what the movie was portraying. We might end up getting into why that is in a little bit. But overall, it wasn't all that bad of an experience, but it was an interesting one from my end.
Yeah, well, the same thing happened to me also with the laughing and stuff, and just being like overly loud in certain sections where it's like, oh, okay, I can see that, but you guys are like going over the top a little bit. I don't know. But before we get into anything with this movie, so recently I just watched Peeping Tom, which came out the same year as Psycho. So many people debate about those two being the grandfather of like modern horror movies. But Peeping Tom was the first movie to put you in the perspective, like the first person perspective of the killer. And I was watching Peeping Tom, and I said, wait a minute, Halloween Resurrection ripped that off when the guy picks up the camera and kills him with the tripod. Directly ripped off from Peeping Tom. Yep.
That is funny.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
so
funny.
I had to say that before we got into it. Also, something else I noticed while watching the credits for this new movie is that PJ Souls, who was one of Laurie's friends, she is in this movie. I don't know if you ever see her per se, but you do hear her voice as Allison's teacher.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Okay,
and
cool.
We do also hear, don't worry, it's not a spoiler, but we do hear a brief recording of Dr. Loomis, but it's not him. It is a voice actor named Colin Mahan, who's really not done much before, and they didn't get the same voice actor from Halloween H2O, who was really good, and he's done a ton of voice acting. So, interesting.
Right. That is interesting. And I know that at least in one scene, I guess that actually a lot of scenes, but one scene in particular, there's I think it's almost like a direct copy of what they had in the original. That may have been the scene with the teacher that you had mentioned. We'll get into that, of course, the finer details. But I did notice that and a couple other things in this movie that were references and parallels to the first one, which is, of course, what I kind of already expected anyways.
Right. We don't know any box office numbers. We don't really know a whole lot. We are recording opening weekend. Alan and I both saw a early Thursday night preview type showing. Right. And I should say my theater was probably about half full. Everybody kind of came at the last minute, and I want to say there was roughly 40, I would guess.
That's not too bad. I mean, for an R-rated movie, that's not too bad. Mine was pretty full, too. I had the biggest theater. I think it seats 300. I had the biggest theater. It wasn't necessarily like overflowing, but there were a lot of people there. I would say there were roughly about 150 maybe that came. Good. So, I mean, still a pretty good turnout for a Thursday night showing. Yeah.
Well, the movie is directed by David Gordon Green, written by Danny McBride, Jason Blum of the infamous Blumhouse now. It was not really infamous, but he's producing, and I believe Blumhouse now either has the rights or they're probably sharing most of the rights, or anyway. Of course, Trancas International is back because they've done like all of them. I think that's a COD production company. And John Carpenter is producing, and he also did the score for this movie, which is a really big deal actually, because the last project John Carpenter worked with, to my remembrance, was Halloween 3, and that kind of didn't count. His like involvement, he never had like that much of an involvement after Halloween 1. He did technically write Halloween 2 and like produced Halloween 3 and whatnot, but then he did sell off the rights to the project after that. But bringing him back is a really big deal, because that means David Gordon Green and Danny McBride have his stamp of approval, and they have him there to consult on this project.
Right, and that is a pretty important thing. One of the things that I was actually looking forward to is because, okay, John Carpenter has somewhat of a hand in this project after I guess 7 movies technically where he didn't really have much to do with it. And so, yeah, this was very interesting to me. I was like, okay, this gives me a little bit more hope that it's not going to be like everything else, and that it's actually going to be, at the very least, competent, because John Carpenter, the man who created this whole thing, is getting back into it. I mean, even though he is not doing it, he may not have the directorial role, but he still has music and production or producer role and stuff like that. So it's still a very important role for the making of this movie. And
it was pretty cool because he also did the score with his son and another guy named Daniel Davies, who I have no idea who that is. And if you stay till the very end, you will see it is dedicated to Mustafa Akkad, which I thought was pretty special.
Yeah, I did too. I was like, wow, interesting. Because I know that he's also been a big player, especially in the later sequels of Halloween, to get those going. So yeah, it was kind of cool that Mustafa Akkad had a tribute at the end of this movie.
Yeah, especially because they could have tributed him in the other ones, like a few sequels back, because I don't remember when he died, but they still had the opportunity, and they never did. They never acknowledged him. So I think this was pretty respectful that they did. Okay, so the cinema score is out. That is the most accurate representation of what audiences thought of the movie. And audiences gave Halloween a B+.
Interesting. Huh. I would have expected it to be like more like an A, or maybe even an A-. But I mean, B+, we talked about that with The First Man. It's not that bad, but it's also not that great necessarily.
Right. That's kind of one of those weird realms where audiences usually give movies A to A- because audiences like most movies. Anything below that, it kind of was receiving a bit of mixed feelings, but not a lot, because B+ is close to A-.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's not like a terrible score or anything. It's just, it is definitely, I would say, probably above average a little bit, but even then. You would expect Halloween to have a much better score, just given the whole name of Halloween.
Well, let's think about this. So I want to draw your attention to there are different millenniums, but Halloween Resurrection also got a B+.
Okay, fair enough.
Halloween H2O got a B-. Audiences liked Resurrection more than H2O at the time.
I guess that makes a bit more sense then. Yeah.
I mean,
it is so weird, though.
It is weird. Resurrection came out 16 years ago during, I mean, they're like completely different eras now, I feel, in the realm of like filmmaking and technology anyways.
Right.
So I'm not going to really compare Resurrection score to this new Halloween score. And the Rob Zombie movies like all got like B- as well or something. The scoring is weird, like how audience has reacted to those, because now that more time has passed since their release, things are very different on how people feel about those movies.
Yeah. Usually, when time passes, things will change. That's probably what happened with Resurrection, is that at the time, it was a pretty fun movie to watch for audiences, but after a while, they were just like,
it's a piece of trash.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're about to jump into the plot. So listeners, we want to let you know that we are going to be spoiling Halloween, the 2018 version. So if you have not seen the new Halloween movie, you would like to see it, not have it spoiled, please click pause right now, run down to your local theater and watch the movie, come back and click play, and we'll be ready to talk about it. October 30th, 2018. It's been 40 years since Michael Myers, Nick Castle returns for the first time, was captured and imprisoned on Halloween night, 1978. Right before Dr. Loomis nearly killed him, but only to be stopped by Officer Hawkins, played by Will Patton. For the 40th anniversary, 2 British journalists, Dana Haynes, played by Rhiannon Reese, and Aaron Corey, played by Jefferson Hall, are creating a podcast about Michael's purposeless, bloody rampage by attempting to interview him at Smith's Grove Sanitarium. With the permission of Dr. Sartain, played by Haluk Billinger, a student of Dr. Loomis, they arrive the day before his transportation to a new maximum security prison. When Michael won't answer their questions, they pull out his old mask they got from the DA's office. The presence of his mask causes the other inmates to be perturbed and to possibly awaken something in Michael. With no luck, the journalists head to Haddonfield, Illinois, to visit the secluded home of Laurie Strode, reprised by Jamie Lee Curtis. Once they gain access to her home, only after paying her $3,000 to do a 2-minute interview, she explains after 2 failed marriages and losing custody of her daughter at age 12, she has lost all hope in life and her single purpose is to be completely prepared with lots of guns and a state-of-the-art bunker security system in case Michael ever does escape. To the misfortune of many people involved, Michael's bus crashes, allowing him to escape by murdering a father and son passing by and stealing their truck. Michael returns to the grave of his sister, Judith Myers, but finds the journalist there. Watching from the shadows, he follows them to a gas station where he murders a mechanic, stealing his jumpsuit, the cashier. That cashier didn't do anything to him. Why would he do that?
Poor cashier.
And the journalist, and dons his infamous mask once again. Back in Haddonfield, it's October 31st, Halloween. Teenager Allison lives a peaceful suburban life with her parents, Karen, played by Judy Greer. Allison is played by Andy Matchik. And Ray, played by Toby Huss. Karen is the daughter of Laurie Strode, therefore Allison is her granddaughter. Graduation is coming soon, and Allison is desperately seeking a relationship from her estranged grandmother. But her mother consistently lies to her that grandma can't make her events. And that's not really confirmed strongly in the movie, but I think it's highly insinuated. On her way to school, Allison meets up with her 2 friends, Dave, played by Miles Robbins, and Vicky, played by Virginia Gardner. The 2 friends probe about Allison's grandmother's experience 40 years ago to the day, inquiring about the long-held rumor Laurie and Michael are siblings. Allison denies the rumor as something people made up to make themselves feel better. At school, Allison meets up with her boyfriend Cameron Elam, played by Dylan Arnold, and their best friend Oscar, played by Drew Sheed. During free time, Allison meets with Laurie by the football field, where Laurie gives her the $3,000 telling her to use it for school or to go to Mexico. So if you think there's a lot of characters so far in this movie, there sort of is.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
The granddaughter tells Laurie she needs to get help and get over Michael. Later that night, after Allison's honor ceremony, her and Cameron go to dinner with her parents when they're interrupted by a distraught Laurie. She recounts how she waited for Michael to board the bus in order to assassinate him in a Bruce Wayne Batman Begins style. But she chickened out. Meanwhile, Officer Hawkins is following a bloody trail of bodies. First he finds the journalist, then he hears of the bus crashing and finds Dr. Sartain accidentally shot by the young boy whom Michael murdered. Then Hawkins arrives at Haddonfield right after Michael claims his next victim. While kids are trick-or-treating, Michael is slicing and dicing just randomly along the neighborhood streets. He goes to the home of Julian, played by Jibral Nantambu, where Vicky is babysitting instead of going to the dance with her friends. Surprisingly, Michael is hiding in Julian's closet. Once he pops out, he murders Vicky and her boyfriend Dave. We never find out what happens to little Julian. Hawkins comes around the house in time to see Michael, and so does Laurie, who followed the police radio. Laurie shoots Michael in the shoulder. Meanwhile, at the dance, Allison catches her boyfriend Cameron cheating on her, which prompts him, in his drunken state, to dump her phone into a punch bowl. Frustrated and dismayed at his betrayal, she leaves the dance with friend Oscar. Laurie arrives at Karen and Ray's house, accompanied by police officers to let them know Michael escaped and he's already racked up a body count. They're all worried when they can't get a hold of Allison, but they leave for Laurie's bunker anyway. While Allison is walking home, Oscar tries to put the moves on her, but is rebuffed by her. Leaving him all alone, he is quickly dispatched by Michael, who then chases Allison. Thankfully, a kind couple calls the police for Allison, and she is taken by Hawkins and Dr. Sartain to Laurie's place. But before they make it there, Hawkins finds Michael walking the street, where he runs him down with his SUV. Sartain and Hawkins get out of the car to check on Michael, when in a surprising twist, Sartain murders Hawkins, puts on Michael's mask, and puts him in the back seat with Allison. Sartain explains after years of studying Michael, he wants to see this inhuman phenomenon at work by studying Michael and Laurie's game of cat and mouse. He too wants to see if Michael will say something, so Allison lies she heard him talk, but first Sartain must stop the car. Once he does stop the car, Michael awakens and smashes Sartain's head like a pumpkin, while Allison flees into the woods. Two cops approach the scene, but are apparently too far away to see anything that happens. Well, of course, Michael makes quick work of them, steals their police car, and drives to Laurie's front door, because apparently she forgot to close her gate. Ray approaches the police car, only to find the two officers murdered, with one holding the other's hollowed-out head with a flashlight shining in it like a jack-o'-lantern. Michael strangles Ray from behind, murdering him. Then Michael enters the house, beating the snot out of Laurie, but she blows two of his fingers off. Karen is hiding in the secret basement, and Allison finds Laurie's shooting range with a bunch of shot-up mannequins, which causes her to scream in fright, but then she comes in the house and is taken downstairs. Meanwhile, upstairs, Laurie hunts Michael in a similar way he hunted her at the end of the first movie. She's thrown off a quasi-balcony where she disappears. Michael rips off the covering of the basement, and Karen cries she needs her mom and can't do it, but aha, it's actually a trick. She grazes Michael's face with a bullet, and Laurie pops up behind Michael to shove him into the basement, where Karen explains, "That's not a cage of fear, it's a trap of death." I added those nouns at the end, by the way. Laurie sets off her Rube Goldberg machine to light the house on fire, supposedly killing off Michael, though we never see the body. Allison flags down a truck, which the three women hitch a ride out of there, as credits roll.
So, one of the traditions of Halloween has always been, well, I guess to a certain extent, has been always to have the opening credits put to a pumpkin, like usually in the background or off to the side. And they bring it back here, finally, after actually, it's been a number of movies since we last saw the pumpkin, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And this is probably my favorite iteration aside from the first one.
Oh, wow.
Because it shows the rotted pumpkin and then plays backwards in time to it being this nice jack-o'-lantern. And then it's of course, after watching the first one, it's essentially the exact same thing from the first one, but played backwards. And does a really interesting job at getting that out there, because we haven't seen a pumpkin intro for a number of years, but B, also kind of goes to show that this series was kind of dead, but we're trying to bring it back now and bring it back to what it was and how it was originally. At least that's what I'm getting out of this opening. And I thought it was really, really well done, which has really surprised me.
I was too. I was thinking, how are they going to handle this? And at first, they don't. They show the classic font, and then it cuts to a brief scene, and he's shouting at Michael to say something, which kind of was giving me the chills. And then it's boom, it jumps into it says Halloween, and then you see this dead pumpkin, and I saw it the same way. It's, to me, I'm okay, this is the pumpkin from the very first movie, but it's been decayed after all these years, and now it's reinvigorated, and it's coming back to life. And I thought that was a nice touch, because I was how are they going to handle it? Halloween did a great job. Halloween 2 had a smart idea, which I liked, of the pumpkin kind of slowly coming open. You see this creepy skull inside, and this one inflated. So, I had a smile on my face.
Yeah, and I did too, but I'm going to have to bring up one of my smaller issues is with the journalists or the podcast people.
Before we get into that real quick, I had something that I wanted to bring up about this plot, because
okay, go ahead.
I kind of wrote down a list of where this plot was kind of cobbled together from, because I feel like this plot isn't completely original. So I came up with 13 things plus 2 bonuses where they kind of got this plot from. So the movie opens in an insane asylum, Halloween Resurrection. Michael steals people's cars by terrorizing a woman in bathroom. That's directly lifted from Halloween H2O. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
I mean, directly. Laurie living a secluded life and a failed marriage, H2O. Laurie having a daughter, Halloween 4. This is sort of a bonus. Laurie wanting to kill her killer and worrying about Michael getting her. That reminded me of Batman Begins, when she's like waiting out there, like Bruce was waiting to shoot Joe Chill. But also in Halloween 2, when she's living in fear and then she like purposely hunts him. Michael escaping from a vehicle crash, directly from Halloween 4. Michael stealing a car and choking someone out from the back seat, Halloween 1. Man and woman wanting to delve into Michael's past, using media to record it, Halloween Resurrection. Michael coming in contact with a baby, that was a big scary moment for many audience members. But we did see that technically in Halloween 2, sort of. Michael getting run over by a car, Halloween 2, Halloween 4, and Halloween H2O. This is the 4th film we've seen that in. Doctor going mad and is actually evil? Well, Dr. Wynn from Halloween 6. Michael killing his doctors, Halloween 2, and I guess you could say both Rob Zombie movies in a way. Michael and Laurie fighting it out. Well, the first movie, the second movie, H2O, Resurrection, and now this movie. So we've seen it 5 times. Michael, quote, dying in a fire at the end of the movie. The ending of Halloween 2, and he is in a fire and supposedly dies in Halloween Resurrection. And for a bonus, getting a ride on a passing truck, that made me think of Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, and I know I read somewhere that they were trying to get this idea of deja vu, but still make it very new in terms of the plot, and that makes a lot more sense because showing how, I guess from what you did, showing where bits and pieces of the story have been played before in the series and in this new movie, I think they do a pretty good job at making it as deja vu-y as they wanted to, but at the same time still making it rather new. This again goes to the fact that it's removing everything after the first movie and just kind of doing it all over again for like the 3rd time, essentially. But yeah, I mean, I did see a lot of parallels in terms of story and everything else, but I guess I didn't realize to what extent that this went to.
Okay, so what were you saying about these journalists? You got a beef with them or something?
Yeah, my problem is I like that they're diving into Michael's past. It kind of gets us back into who Michael Myers is in the first place and where we're at in the story from the first one, right? That part is fine. Now, my problem is after a certain point, they really only serve as exposition to the audience because they don't necessarily impact the story, except to give Michael his mask. And after they die at the gas station, nothing that they did ever impacts the story except for the fact that, hey, Michael got his mask back. Other than that, everything with them just kind of feels like it was just there for the audience and not necessarily there to impact the story per se.
Yeah, I'm sure the storytellers for this one were thinking, how are we going to get the audience back into a 40-year-old franchise, especially one that only ties directly to the first movie. So yeah, they kind of decided to use this journalist foil where, they're doing an interview, and that gives us a chance to see Michael kind of as an old man after all these years. Also gives us a chance to be introduced to Laurie Strode, and I guess it might not be the most creative or the most organic way to kind of bring us back into these characters. And yes, they do get murdered and Michael gets his mask back. And that's pretty much the end of them. But I guess I really didn't have too much of an issue with it. And for the most part, I feel like this first act is fairly strong because we're not like lingering too long, I feel the pacing is well done in the beginning. And yeah, we do get the biggest exposition scene with an actual flashback of Michael in 1963 stabbing his sister Judith, which I might point out is the only instance of nudity in this whole movie. So this is surprisingly probably the cleanest Halloween movie.
Right. And I mean, that also kind of goes to one of my other issues is this movie has a lot of stuff in it, but I don't think it really juggles it all very well. Namely, a lot of characters and a lot of subplots. And the reason why I say this is because the very first Halloween was very straightforward. There were really only two subplots that we ever needed to keep track of. That was Loomis's subplot and Laurie's subplot, and maybe one of her friends. But they were very connected to Laurie, so it made it so even though there were three, it was very easy to track. This one, although it isn't necessarily hard to track, there's just a lot of stuff here. And this is why I bring up the fact that I don't really like the journalists, is because you already have to keep track of Laurie, Allison, and then Allison's mom. I forget her name. But we have to keep track of those three. And then we also have to keep track of Dr. Loomis, the new Dr. Loomis, more or less. And we have to keep track of Michael's story and how he tracks along and gets to where he's at. There's a lot of subplots that we had to keep track of in this movie. Once again, I never got confused necessarily, but it was just a lot to take in compared to the very minimalist story that was from the first one. And that's where my biggest issue comes in, is that they feel like, at least from what I understand, that more is better. And for a movie like Halloween, that's not necessarily true. What made the first one scary is how simple it was. And that was what made it scary. And this one is it just feels very bloated with a lot of things that move the plot along that I think could have been chopped out and minimalized a bit more to make it a bit easier to follow, I guess I could say.
Yes, I do agree that I will admit right now that this movie does get bloated with how many unnecessary side plots and characters that they introduce that don't really pay off, unless it's just for like tiny little bits and pieces that really don't feel worth it to me, worth spending this much time on or setting up these characters if we're just only going to. I'll get into that in just a second. But what I want to say is that I do feel like it's fairly well compartmentalized. We only get the journalist really in Act 1, and then we are introduced to Allison and the family and all the friends in Act 2. And Act 2 is, I'll say something about that in a minute. So I guess what I'm saying is I really didn't have an issue with Act 1. I actually thought of all three acts, Act 1 is actually the strongest one. Because I guess maybe the journalists aren't my favorite way for getting back into the Halloween series, but maybe we do spend a little too much time with them on Act 1 because that's what pretty much it's all about until the bus crash, and then we kind of transition into Act 2 and Michael is walking around and stuff. But I guess I thought the journalists were pretty good, and I thought the pacing, at least in Act 1, was really strong. It was moving along at a really good pace for me. We're getting to different events, sequences of events. And I do also want to bring up, I thought Laurie's introduction was well done. And this is probably the most believable Laurie we've ever gotten. This actually did feel like Laurie Strode to me. And Jamie Lee Curtis does give a really good performance. And I actually do feel for her degraded life, her really sad life. Also, the movie's pretty gory and violent right in the beginning, to let you know, yes, this is going to be a modern day slasher. We're kind of bringing Halloween into the 21st century. Whereas, yes, the first Halloween is violent, but not to this level at all. And I guess maybe in the first act we do meet Allison and her family. It's kind of fuzzy for me where Act 1 ends with the journalists, and then do we meet the family? I don't know. Like you said, it is a lot of characters to remember and juggle. I guess I'm just saying, to begin with, I'm okay with it. But once we get into Allison's personal life and friends, that's when I have the issue.
Right, yeah, and that's kind of where my opinion comes in. My criticism is really, I mean, the first act, it is pretty good for the most part. Even though the journalists aren't really all that great, it is still rather compelling and being introduced to everybody and all stuff like that. So I will agree with you to a certain extent that Act 1 is one of the probably the strongest act, because it is the most straightforward with everything else that happens in this movie. To that extent, I'll agree with you. But I'm once again, if they kept the journalists throughout the whole movie and had them impact the plot a bit more, I feel like it would have made it even more stronger. But they didn't really necessarily do that, because they die really at the end of Act 1, like you said. But yeah, I mean, for the opening of this, it really isn't all that bad. I was really engaged. In fact, I was pretty much engaged for this whole movie, because of how it is. It does still keep things very interesting. Once again, how interesting those things get after the fact, we'll talk about, because we're not there yet. But yes, for the most part, I do think that this first act is pretty good for the most part.
Well, I do also like some of the visual callbacks that they present in this movie, I think those are nice homages. One of the ones that stood out to me, at least in the first act, was a shot of Allison in the classroom in the backseat, kind of where Laurie would have sat. And the camera kind of zooms into her, just like in Halloween. She looks out the window, and you're kind of expecting Michael, but how could that really be? And it's not. It's Laurie. I thought that was great.
Right. Yeah. And even this is what I mentioned in the beginning. The speech that the teacher gives in here, I think, is either very similar or is the same as in the original Halloween, because they both talk about fate. Oh, wow. I know that much. And I noticed that watching the original Halloween yesterday, and I was just like, wait a minute. Now, this seems very, very similar. I'm not entirely sure if they're the same speech, but I know they are similar because they both mentioned fate in both the speeches. And then, yes, very, very interesting callback with Laurie Strode actually standing outside instead of Michael, which... Yeah, there are a lot of interesting callbacks in this.
Yeah. So Act 1 is pretty good with the bus crashing, and they're trying to... The son had a really hoarse voice, and he accidentally shoots the doctor. That was kind of an odd scene, but still pretty good. I think the horror atmosphere is at least being built fairly well in first one. I feel like we're rising with... how everything is escalating and going down. The body count is being racked up faster than really any, like, just standalone Halloween movie. At least it seems that way.
Right, right. And I mean, kind of typical to Halloween, we have just this scene of just some random people driving down the road and then they encounter Michael. Yep. That happens a lot in this movie. And then, like, once or twice is okay, but I think it happens like maybe 3 or 4 times here, because I know the first one had at least 1 or 2 of those scenes. I think it's just 1 actually, where just like some random person that you meet up and they encounter Michael. And here it doesn't really bother me all that much, although I don't think the kid is all that great of an actor, and the lines he's given are really fitting of a small kid. But besides the fact, it does really start bringing in this very horror aspect when the kid is attacked by Michael in the car. It's pretty spooky.
Yeah, they go there.
To see that. And I like how we don't really see how the bus crashed. We just know they just come across the bus has already crashed and everyone has already left. All the inmates who are in there have already kind of wandered off or are wandering off. It does kind of leave it up to the imagination of what happened. Like, did they attack somebody? You know, what exactly went down in this bus? We never really get an answer about that, and I really enjoy that part of it.
Yes, they do preserve an air of mystery fairly well in this movie, which is important because the very original Halloween was completely built on that mystery. You don't know why Michael is chasing these girls. He just is, and that's what makes it terrifying. They don't need to over-explain it, and this movie doesn't explain... The movie doesn't even go into their history, Michael and Laurie's history. We just know that they are actually not brother and sister.
Right, and I mean, I would say to a certain extent, they don't really... They keep things pretty mysterious, but I think one of my issues with them keeping things mysterious is that they sometimes don't. With the original, you get to see how Michael makes it to Haddonfield, but it doesn't exactly explain how he got there. It just shows you the aftermath. Like in one scene, Loomis comes across, I think it's a tow truck of these two guys that, or I guess the guys who had previously owned it were not there anymore, and you see Michael's sheets just kind of laying around. And you kind of just get to track how Michael gets to Haddonfield by giving you very, very little information. The bus crash is really the only instance where I think it doesn't exactly explain, and it kind of just leaves it up to the imagination. But after this, you get to watch Michael as he makes it to Haddonfield and then makes it to Laurie, and how Laurie's side of the story also does that too. And I would have really enjoyed if they kind of kept that air of mystery. I feel like that would have helped build the tension between the two having the standoff at the very end. But they don't really do that in this one, which is kind of unfortunate.
One thing that I did like, though, is although we do get some, pretty good shots of Michael's face, actually, they're always still partial shots. They're always from behind. We never see his face full on. We only get bits and pieces. And that was kind of a gutsy move for them to do, but I was okay with it.
Yeah, I know in the original you do get a brief glimpse of his face when his mask is ripped off. But even then, it's really quick. And this one, I think you do get a couple of glimpses, but they're A, pretty distant shots, and B, they're really also really quick. So yeah, they do keep Michael's face a mystery. All you really need to know is that he's old and that he's mad. And so they do a pretty good job at keeping his face a mystery. That is, of course, akin to what his character is more a representation of. They do a pretty good job at this, at keeping his face a mystery and always focusing on the mask, more or less, and then everything like that.
And in the other movies, they've pretty much always tried their best to dehumanize Michael. Even in the first movie, Loomis is saying he's not human, and he appears to be inhuman with how much physical damage he can take to his body and still get back up. He just keeps coming. But in the beginning of this movie, they do try to humanize him because Laurie Strode said he is a he, because the journalists, I think, are calling Michael an it, or somebody is, I can't remember. And just by even having him without the mask on for that long, even though he is murdering people, still does humanize him. You can still see he is old now. He's a very old man. So I did actually like that aspect. I'm glad they didn't just go into this soulless, blank, demonic-esque force. They're like, this is an old man who is insane, attacking people. He has some power, and he still has some type of vendetta to come after Laurie Strode and her descendants. So I thought they handled that well.
Yeah, I think that they, for the most part, do handle that pretty well. And I know that in the first one, there's a conversation. Actually, the first time we meet Dr. Loomis, him and this nurse, as they're driving to the asylum, he refers to Michael as it, and the nurse says, "Can we refer to him as a he instead of it?" So I'm pretty sure that's just a callback to that conversation in the car. But yeah, I mean, they do a pretty good job at, once again, keeping Michael. He has his mask off for a lot of the time, but still keeping him very shapy. Once again, they keep his face a mystery, which kind of goes to add to that horror aspect of this movie.
So Act 2 is where I personally felt the movie got quite meandering, with a bunch of these teenagers stuff and characters that really don't have any meaning or any purpose, and there's very little to no payoff with them. So I didn't really appreciate that aspect of it. And whereas Laurie's friends, Michael, first of all, he saw them, so he knew who to come after, and then he purposely, systematically killed them, or they just so happened to show up where he was, and then he killed them, and he, in a way, was luring Laurie in as a trap. This movie really doesn't do that. It's just kind of like, hey, teenagers, let's kill them, or just have them be there for almost no reason. I understand we need to humanize Allison and show that she has a social life and friends, but they could have worked those characters in a more effective way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's kind of funny because when the friends showed up for the very first time, my very first question was, okay, when are they going to die? Sure. And they never dive into their characters really at all. I think the only instance where this kind of happens is after Allison breaks up with her boyfriend and walks home with, I forget his name. They have somewhat of an exchange, but only a small exchange, as he tries to become her boyfriend, more or less. So it's an interesting exchange, but at the same time, it's also kind of a cliche as well. And so these friends, they really aren't all that important to the story, which once again makes me ask, why are they here then? I mean, I get, yes, of course, Allison needs to have friends, but at the same time, if they're not going to impact the story that much, then why even have them? I think, once again, the only person that actually has somewhat of an impact is that kid that she walks home with, and then he gets killed by Michael with the motion sensing floodlights. Once again, it just kind of, for me, after a certain point, I was like, okay, once the scene began, I knew exactly how it was going to play out with these friends, because that's happened time and time again in these movies. And it's just kind of, it's not necessarily copying, but it's in the same vein as the first one. So it's just like, okay, when are they going to die for me? And after a while, it became kind of repetitive, I guess, because I'm just like, I know how this scene's going to play out. And it's not as much as a surprise anymore.
Well, and the other thing that I kind of had an issue with was how Michael is portrayed here.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the big scenes of this movie that they did show in the trailer was this kind of one shot of Michael walking the streets on Halloween night with all the trick-or-treaters, and he's picking up a hammer and hitting some lady over the head. Then he gets a knife and peeks in some lady's window and goes and stabs her. So when he is walking the streets, I am loving the atmosphere. The colors are really vibrant. It's very creepy. It does look very much like something John Carpenter would shoot, or something very close to the original. But unfortunately, Green and McBride just don't know how to harness that into something powerful. I feel that they think just shooting scenes that look akin to the original Halloween with scary lighting and camera work is enough, but it's not. And I'm not asking them to create the original because I wouldn't want them to rip that off. I just want them to take their time in this world like Carpenter did, instead of like just jumping to story beats here in the second act. Plus, I might say that Michael never randomly killed people in the first movie. It was always with a purpose and with a point to further the story along. This scene is just really unnecessary for Michael to just be like, oh, time for me to just kill a bunch of random people now. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that I had a big problem. Although it looks nice, because it is, for the most part, one very long, continuous shot as he walks through, I think, 2 or 3 houses and kills people there. But yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head. They don't take their time. And I think that's probably my biggest issue when it comes to this movie, is that there's a lot here, and I think it could work, but they don't take their time to really develop it to a impactful way. Michael is, I think, the biggest offense of this, because in the original, they take deliberate time, and things really don't begin happening until halfway through the movie. They take a lot of time to build up his character as he stalks Laurie Strode and her friends, but mostly Laurie, through the neighborhood. And you get this clear sense of direction of what he's going to do, but you just don't know how he's going to do it. And that's the joy of the movie. This one, you kind of already know because it's a sequel to the first one. But at the same time, the biggest problem is this movie moves way too fast, in my own personal opinion. No, a lot of scenes just are really cut really quick, and it kind of doesn't leave a very big lasting impact for me personally, because things are moving so fast that they aren't given enough time to sit and settle like with the first one, because the movie is very slow, but it's very effective because it's very slow. And when I watched this with a couple of friends last night, this slow, deliberate building freaked the crap out of them, because just seeing Michael stand there in the corner of the screen and hearing him breathe for a very long time as Laurie and her friends walk down the sidewalk was unnerving for them. And to be fair, this is meant to be that way. And they do a really good job at that, but they don't really ever get anything like that here. You never get long scenes of Michael just kind of standing in the background and you hear the breathing, the labored breathing as he watches somebody. You never really get that. I mean, maybe to a certain extent, yes, but it never really gets inside your head and makes you feel very paranoid like the first one does. I think that's kind of not, I think that's probably one of the weaker points of this movie.
Yeah, I just really wasn't feeling that suspense.
No.
Sure, when there was intense scenes, I was tensed up, I was into the scene, but the atmosphere never built to a point where I was really on edge, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, once again, with the atmosphere, I was never really scared in this movie.
No.
I can't really think of one moment where I was scared. And I watched the original last night, and that movie's still scary to me. Yeah. Even though I would say they both, in a general sense, don't really have all that great of acting, except for maybe Laurie Strode in this one. But the atmosphere that is built up because of the first one makes it scary, and that's what makes it so effective. This one, I never was scared. Yes, there were some intense scenes, but they were never really all that intense, in my own opinion, because there was never really all that atmosphere in the background to help build the scene up as well.
Well, and also the other thing is the first movie is aided by John Carpenter's incredible score. His score that should have won an award. John Carpenter did come back and compose a score with 2 other people. Now, I do think there are parts of this score that are great, but it is not as effective as the first one. And I don't know if it was my theater or not, but some of these like musical cues where Michael comes on screen or something's supposed to happen, they just weren't very loud. I need them to be kind of loud because that's how the first movie was. I mean, the first movie gets you and Michael as a kid looks up at the window and then that creepy music plays and then it just carries that note throughout the whole rest of the scene. I just feel like we didn't get that in this one. So I guess, although I did like parts of Carpenter's score, some parts were great. I was just disappointed it wasn't at the level I was expecting it to be.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. I do think that the score is good. I think that it does sound really, really nice, especially with the added advantage of using an electric guitar. And I think the best scene in my mind where the music is used very, very well would have been the scene when Allison is being chased by Michael Myers. And the track of that is Allison is hunted, or no, the shape hunts Allison or something like that on the soundtrack. It is very, very good and well executed. Yeah. And I talked to Tommy or Thomas about this, and he said, the reason why is because when there's a big drop a couple of times in the song, the reason why it also helps both the scene is because the drop doesn't happen on the downbeat, it happens on the and of 4 at the very end of the measure. And because of that, it kind of unnerves you because you're not expecting it at all. And the music, for the most part, I think does a good job. But yes, you're very right. The first one had a huge emphasis on its music because of how simple it was. But at the same time, it was so simple and that made it also very scary. This one, it's a bit more elaborate. There's a lot more to the score in terms of instrumentals. And although it still keeps the original theme, in its forefront, it also is maybe a bit too much when it comes to making things scary. In terms, at least, with Halloween, because the original does a really good job with such a simple score. This one, although sometimes effective, not nearly as effective as the original.
Well, and I do wish that Carpenter could have used his Halloween Returns 1981 mix for the main theme of this movie, at least for maybe the beginning and end, because I played that for you. That would have been so great because that was kind of a culmination of those original movies kind of combined together. And I just wish we could have had that.
That would be really nice.
Well, okay, one of the other issues that I had was why in the world is Michael in Jill, whatever his name is, the little boy's closet, just for Vicky to shut the door and then for Michael to jump out? And it doesn't make any sense. How did he even know to go there? What was the point of going there? He never saw this girl before. He doesn't even know the connection. This scene is just out of the blue. Oh, we need Michael to kill a teenager now. Let's throw it in there. And then when the little boy says, "Oh, S word," my audience laughed so loud. I was chuckling too. I think we were all laughing. It was funny, but it completely undercut the tension of the scene. And then when it was built back up, it was still undercut by literally cutting away and not really finishing the scene with Dave. And I understand that, yes, sometimes less is more and they don't want to show everything, but they haven't set that precedent yet because they've pretty much showed everything. I mean, I guess except when Michael was like shutting the shade and stuff. But this movie just seems to either be like, oh, sometimes we'll show super gory kills or sometimes we'll cut away and you'll just see the aftermath. And it's like, well, which is it?
Right. And that also goes into my issue of tone. There are times in this movie that what you mentioned is probably the biggest issue, is that this moment that they build up is supposed to be really scary because you're not expecting Michael to be there at that moment until she goes to close the closet door and she can't close it for whatever reason. And then, of course, Michael pops out. The little kid is hilarious, and I think he's utilized, for the most part, really well for comedic relief, right? I would say up until this point, he was used really well because he is a really funny kid. Until Michael pops out and then he runs out of the room, and then my audience laughed then, and then when when the girl here, I forget her name, but when she goes to run too, and then she slips on the ground, audience laughed again. It's meant to be a very tense scene, but is undercut and really everything just kind of deflates after the kid runs out and yells. It doesn't fit. It's a very conflicting tone that I don't think was utilized well at all, at least in this scene. And there were a couple other scenes, a couple other examples this was also a thing where the tone is shifted real quick without really any throughput to make it to make it a bit more subtle or easier to get into from one scene to the next. Never really happens in this one. For the most part, it's okay, but there are certain scenes where it's very jarring because the tone shifts real hard. This is one of those scenes.
Well, speaking of things that doesn't fit, Dr. Sartain is evil?
Now, see, I thought this was an original, not original. I thought this was a very interesting idea at first.
No,
but
I did
they
too.
Don't really take their time to do anything with it.
No, see, I did too. I was like, whoa, okay, this is a great twist. And in the theater, I had my own little theory, which was quickly diminished. I thought, oh my gosh, what if this is actually a secret retelling or secret sequel to The Curse of Michael Myers, and Dr. Sartain has been passed down from The Curse of Thorn has been passed down from Dr. Loomis, and I was like, but it wasn't at all.
Yeah.
I was wondering what explanation they would give. It was a good twist for a movie that has been fairly straightforward so far, and I was into it. He murders the police officer. He puts on the mask, and then he just basically says, "Oh, I just want to see this game of cat and mouse happen." And then I'm like, "Oh, so he maybe has some like control over Michael." Nope, Michael just kills him. And that's it.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of funny too because they actually legitimately bring up the fact that, oh, you're the new Loomis. And he goes, yeah, kind of. And it is kind of true, but he plays such a minor role compared to what Loomis ever did in the first one. Which is fine. I understand that their focus is not necessarily on Loomis as much as it is on the family of the Strodes, of Laurie's family from her daughter to her granddaughter. But at the same time, he kind of just becomes a plot device in this scene, especially when he turns and wants to see Michael. And I guess I kind of understand what he's getting at because he wants to more or less do an experiment without the restrictions of doing a psychological experiment. He wanted to see Michael in his raw form. Once again, that goes nowhere. And then his death is rather gruesome for a Halloween movie because Michael stomps on his face and his brains explode.
Yeah.
It feels rather gruesome for at least a Halloween movie. I don't think that really fit very well with how everything else that Halloween, at least from the first one especially.
Yeah. So now going into Act 3, I personally felt Act 3 was just meh. So the Big Dukaroo, to quote the Joker, is exciting and intense in many ways, especially when Laurie thinks Michael's in the closet, which flips the scenario and her going out the balcony and disappearing. But honestly, I just felt like this isn't what I wanted here with the end. I was like, yeah, okay, it's starting strong, but then it's just like I would say the whole of this movie kind of starts strong and then it just kind of slowly kind of fizzles out, and it wasn't frightening like the original. And I wanted to be left on a high note, but it wasn't a low note either, but it was more just a medium note, making me feel like, yeah, that was fine. And I'm not that excited for a sequel. And I will say, I think Halloween 1, 2, 4, and maybe even H2O had a better, more exciting ending than this one.
Right. And I think part of the reason why this ending isn't really all that great, I mean, it's fine, but it's really nothing spectacular, I guess, is because the biggest focus is on the three girls here. We have Laurie Strode, who is the main character, and we have her daughter, and then her daughter, who is Allison. The problem is, Allison is built up throughout a lot of this movie, and then before the third act begins, she's just dropped. And we don't really get much else past that, except for a couple of scenes of her getting to where her mom and Laurie are at.
And a really dumb shot of her with the mannequins.
Right. I mean, I guess we're to assume that she was around where Laurie's house was, and that because in the beginning we do see her shooting mannequins, Laurie. And so I'm guessing that's where she's at, but the movie never really explains where she's at exactly. It just is kind of there to heighten the tension, but doesn't really do that much for it. So that's part of it. And then you've also got the mom. And to be frank, I don't like the mom at all. Because I don't think she really does all that great of acting, especially in one scene where she recounts her past childhood with Laurie to her daughter Allison, and it comes out of nowhere, and her acting is super bland. I don't really like her all that much, and this once again goes to the fact that there is just too much in this movie, for a Halloween movie especially, to make things as effective, because they have to build things up to this point, and they think that they built up Laurie pretty well, but when it comes to the mom and the daughter, they fall pretty flat. I think one of the more interesting things about this movie is its take on family, because you have the generations here. You have mom, or you have Laurie, the grandmother of Allison, and the mom of mom. I don't know the mom's name; it slips my mind. But then you've also got mom, who was taught in the vein of Laurie to more or less prepare herself for the real world. She says, as Laurie says, But at one moment, I think it's very interesting because they're having a conversation, Mom and Laurie are, and she says, the world is not an evil place like you think. Everyone is happy and understanding. And she, of course, pushes her mom out. And then she comes to realize that her mom was kind of right and that she kind of needs to be prepared for the rest of the world or for whatever else is going to happen out there. Not just that everything is so happy and understanding, because that's not necessarily true. And then you've also got Allison, the daughter, which I think is very interesting because she knows she has a connection with her grandmother, with Laurie Strode, and her grandma wants the best for her, and she's trying to connect with her grandma, but her mom is kind of in the way of all this, and she's like, I don't really think that's a great idea to connect with your grandma. And then at the end, they all kind of come together into one big happy family again. I just think this is very interesting that they bring this up, and it is kind of, I guess, woman empowerment there towards the end when they all three take on Michael, the whole family. But at the same time, I once again don't think it's executed all that well.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the family dynamics were fine. I don't think they were too strong. I guess it might have been a little hard for them to have time to develop that when they're also trying to balance being stalked by a killer. How do you bring that up in an organic way and develop those relationships? And that can be difficult to do over one movie. I mean, the first Halloween movie isn't too strong on character relationships. They're just teenage friends per se. So I guess I did like the family dynamics. I will say I like the granddaughter much better than the mom. The granddaughter honestly seemed like, yeah, she could be a real offspring of Laurie Strode. They kind of looked similar. They had a similar build and height and whatnot. The mom didn't really seem too similar to them and didn't serve much of a purpose except to kind of just lie to her daughter about the grandma and kind of just be frustrated about the dysfunction of everything. And then we realize that she does have this almost sociopathic level training where she is just lying in fear this whole time until it's been all just a trick. It's a surprise. And she shoots him in the head. She didn't completely shoot him in the head, but close enough. So, right. I mean, I thought that was a decent trick. I mean, honestly, though, that was the only scene I was feeling for the daughter when she was saying, Mom, I can't do it. I'm scared. I was like, well, that's really sad. Yeah, that's kind of an emotional moment. But then when she's like, gotcha, and shoots him, I was like, oh my gosh. So, yeah, the three of them working together I thought was the right move because they're all very estranged from each other, at least with the grandma. But then they come together, so I thought that was fine. That was well handled. Yeah,
I mean, once again, this is interesting, but I think that they could have taken it much farther. I think this is also probably the fact that there is way too much in this movie for it to have any meaningful impact. In my own opinion, they probably should have cut Allison out completely because her backstory doesn't really impact the plot at all. We have a scene with her boyfriend, but that makes no sense in the grand scheme of things because he does nothing for the rest of the story. Then you have the scene. Really, the reason that's there is so she can come across Michael when she's walking home with the other guy. Other than that, I think Allison probably could have been cut out completely because I think it should have been with just Laurie and her daughter, and maybe even her daughter raising her kid and having that dichotomy, not necessarily having the kid as a main character. I think that would have worked better. It kind of simplified things. But I think what they're going for here is a generational thing. They're showing the generations of the different Halloween movies, which I kind of understand. But at the same time, I think they could have really simplified this idea and made it a bit more stronger. Really, with everything in this movie, I think that it kind of applies to. If they would have simplified it, they could have made it stronger. And that kind of goes for just the whole movie in general.
Well, I think Allison was necessary to this plot to show that, yes, after 40 years, Laurie does have a granddaughter. It seems to be the most logical situation. And to kind of first of all, to bring in the younger audience and tie it back to Laurie's teenage years when she was in the first movie. But I just think they should have cut out a lot of Allison's teenage situations because those just really didn't do much to serve the plot, and those could have been times building character between her mom and grandma, because it was interesting how Allison really wants a relationship with her grandma, but then her mom is like, see, your grandma's kind of a nutcase when she comes to the dinner. And so I thought those were all fine sequences, but instead of continuing on that path, we just pretty much cut to Allison being with their friends, getting lost, getting chased, and then they come back together and nothing really happens. I'm wondering if they're going to save it up for a sequel where they can develop those relationships more. The last shot of the movie is Allison holding Michael's knife. Not really sure what that's supposed to mean, but hopefully those relationships will be built maybe a little more in a good way. I don't want Allison to become another Danielle Harris in Halloween 4 and 5.
Right, and I mean that's kind of what I'm saying is that I think that she could have been cut out because she doesn't. There isn't much there. What's there is somewhat interesting with her and her grandma, but at the same time, it just kind of feels like it's there because they have to bring in the other audiences for this movie. Once again, if they had simplified it or maybe even worked it better into the story, I think it could have worked better. Because I think that the stuff with grandma I think is interesting. At the same time, though, there is everything else you have to take into this, and it just kind of feels like, well, every other movie has teenagers in it, so this one has to have teenagers in it. And I don't know, it doesn't really work for me very well, especially after a certain point, Allison just kind of drops off. And then I'm just like, well, then why was she here in the first place?
Yeah, she does just kind of have these few shots of her running in the woods forever, which was a little surprising. Right. But once again, that would be kind of difficult to juggle 3 different characters and give them something legitimate to do when only one, being Laurie Strode, being the really only one to make sense as of this movie, to take on Michael and have a final fight with him. So maybe in the next movie, Laurie won't play as big of a part. I'm assuming it'll be more so Allison to kind of have a bit of a bigger part. But they kind of did run into a conundrum where it's like, we got Judy Greer hanging out in the basement. Allison's running through the woods. This gives us time to watch Laurie and Michael chase each other around and fight. And then we'll bring them back together at the very end so they can all kind of take him on in one scene together. I mean, I guess from a story standpoint, that makes the most sense. But yes, it is unfortunate that there really isn't a whole lot to do for these other characters in the climax.
Yeah. Okay, so do you want to do final thoughts now, or do you not have time?
So, Alan, what is your rating and recommendation for Halloween?
So, I think my biggest problem with Halloween is that it's not scary. It's not all that scary, and I think the reason why is because they don't take their time to build things up, and part of that is maybe even due to the fact that there is too much in this movie. Because there is too much in this movie. They could have cut out the journalist. They could have probably cut out Allison. They probably could have cut out the sheriff, or at least the sheriff's story, or trimmed it down. They probably could have cut out almost all of Loomis's story. They could have done a lot of trimming here and made the story a bit more simpler to follow, just like the original. Not to say that it has a copy off the original, but it could have been a much simpler movie and made it a lot more effective. But for whatever reason, it's really bloated. I don't really know why. But it is, and that really impacts the story. But okay, that's part of it. And the other part of it is, this movie is very cheesy, which I understand is that the first one is also very cheesy, and I'm not really going to defend the fact that because of its cheesy, it doesn't aid the story, because in some sense it does, but in some sense it also takes away. But at the same time, this one is made in 2018, and in my opinion, you don't really need to have a story that is so cheesy just because the original is cheesy. You can make it brand new. You can do new things with it. So that's another part of it. And then the other part of it is, this doesn't feel like a really big horror movie to me. It feels like it's filmed more like an action movie, with a lot of things, especially there towards the end. Yes, there are intense and kind of spooky moments, but I was never scared, especially there towards the end and a couple of scenes before. It just kind of felt like we're filming for an action movie rather than we are for a horror movie. And Michael's portrayal is very weak here because, once again, I don't think that they don't portray Michael very well. They kind of drop him. They don't really build up his character where he just kind of stands and stalks people. He just kind of does a lot of things. We get to see every step of the way of how he gets to Laurie's house. That being said, I was never bored with this movie. I found a lot of the scenes to still be enjoyable despite my many criticisms, and especially with 1 or 2 tracks in the soundtrack are very, very good. With that being said, I'm still going to give it a recommend, a very slight recommend, because I think that it is the second best Halloween movie that we have, despite my numerous criticisms. But at the same time, it should have been much more. It feels like they played it way too safe for this movie, in my own personal opinion. Again, it seems to be a common trend with a lot of remakes and sequels and stuff here. So, in terms of score, 6 out of 10, it's a slight recommend for me.
After years of having my heart broken by trashy sequels, Halloween is a true return to Carpenter's original back in 1978. The camera work is incredibly well done, which may be my biggest compliment to this movie, because the camera, though feeling 21st century, is still very reminiscent of Halloween. And Halloween 2, I guess I might add. I also must compliment the editing and John Carpenter's score, though it isn't as near as great as Halloween 1 or 2, which is a disappointment because I was quite pumped for a new Carpenter Halloween score. Jamie Lee gives her most believable Laurie performance since the original. She makes me feel for her sad predicament, and I love her tough persona. This is the best Halloween sequel we've ever gotten. It's close to on par with H2O, but it's still better, and it's much better than the direct sequel, Halloween 2, since it actually stands alone, unlike the DLC-esque nature of Halloween 2. This movie begins with really strong potential. It's giving me the original vibes, the story is well told through great pacing, and the fear factor is strong. Act 1 starts for me at a 9, Act 2 brings it down to an 8, and Act 3 lands the film at a 7. Unfortunately, this movie just didn't go for it like I expected it to. Even Carpenter's musical cues felt weak, and there never was that crazy intense scene racking my nerves with fright. I am confused with the storytelling because of how strong it starts, and then it pads the runtime with meaningless side plots, and Act 2 and 3 are this fast crumbling mudslide. Also, it introduces the dreadful aspect of the sequels of Michael being in random places just so he can kill someone. Certain plot elements like Dr. Sartain being evil is a nice twist, but they didn't go anywhere with it. The climax has potential and is well done in certain ways, but ultimately I was expecting something bigger, and I'm disappointed I didn't get that. As soon as the house caught on fire and the ladies got in the truck, I knew the movie was over, and I wasn't pleased with the ending, because it was just too easy, since we've seen this before, and better done, I may say, in Halloween 2. Although Michael blankly staring and standing there as they torched the basement gave me the real deal creeps, but by not showing us Michael's body, I know we're getting a sequel. I really, really wish Carpenter would direct and write, and Carpenter technically wrote Halloween 2, although it is vastly inferior to his previous work. I still believe the best true Halloween sequel is still out there in our future. I'm hoping for an extended cut of this movie because there is footage in the trailers missing from the movie. So like I said, I'm hoping that'll clear things up and give us more rounded out version where certain story directions actually pay off and don't just pad the runtime. Halloween receives 7 stars out of 10 since I believe it's a good movie and it gets a mild recommend. I was really expecting a higher score and I'm sad I can't give it. So listeners, by the time you're listening to this, I'm already deep into the novelization of this movie, so I'm excited to see what that will add to the story. I'll put a post up on the website giving my thoughts once I've finished.
Now, I have a question. Did you stay to the end of the credits?
No. Should I have?
Yes.
What?
Because you hear the labored breathing of Michael at the very last few seconds
of cool.
the credits. So it just kind of adds on to the fact that, yeah, Michael's still alive and out there somewhere.
If I'm not mistaken, the very end of the 1978 credits is the same way.
Okay. I guess I didn't really stick around for that either. So. But
yeah. So briefly just on that end, I was disappointed they were going to just basically trap him in there and catch him on fire because we've already seen him on fire in Halloween 2 and a little bit in Resurrection, but I'm like, really? We're just going to let him go on fire? And they don't even show us the body, so I was just kind of like, what is this ending?
Right. And I was wondering if they were going to go the route of dismemberment because I do blow off his fingers. So I'm just like, yeah, that's a good question. Why don't they just chop Michael into pieces? Would he be able to come back then? But they never really go down that route, unfortunately. No. So what is my beef with this title? I think it's stupid. The reason why is because this is the 3rd movie called Halloween, just straight up Halloween, which had they been rebooting the series, which is kind of not true for this movie. It would have made a little bit more sense, kind of like with Rob Zombie's Halloween. That was rebooting the entire series over again. The problem is, this is a sequel to the first Halloween, which is named also Halloween. Why didn't they just call it Halloween 2? Or maybe something different like Michael Myers Returns, or something that signified that it is a direct sequel to the original Halloween without just taking the whole title and then using that as the title of this new movie. Because I think it's confusing, I think, is what is the biggest part. There's the biggest criticism that I have. It is just confusing because this is not a retelling of the whole story again. This is a sequel to the first one, but at the same time also still being kind of a reboot. I just think it's confusing to name it Halloween, but it not be a reboot, a full reboot of the series.
So where does this rank for you on the scale?
Well, I kind of mentioned it in my final thoughts, but it's number 2, right after the first one. But once again, that's not saying a lot. Number 2, albeit it is fine for the most part, it's really weak in terms of just a straight up movie because it needs the first one to carry it. And once again, like we have mentioned multiple times, it's more or less just DOC. So in my list, it's number 2, then everything else after that. Yeah,
the only reason I'll mention it is because I shuffled it a tiny bit because I did rewatch 2 yesterday. So I think just my top 5 were Halloween, John Carpenter's version, David Gordon Green's Halloween, and then it's H2O, Halloween 4, and then Halloween 2. So those were my top 5.
Right.
But listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this really long 11-month Halloween retrospective series. We did it, Alan. We're done. We have reviewed all the Halloween movies so far.
Finally. We can actually record good stuff. Ugh.
But it was fun. We had fun recording it.
Yeah.
I like talking about bad movies sometimes because I know you listeners enjoy listening to us kind of dump on certain movies that are bad. At least I like listening to like Now Playing do that sometimes. It's fun. So hopefully you guys listening to us talk about that stuff too. But once again, thank you for listening. If you want some more bonus podcasts, you want some extras, click the link in the description below to support us. You'll get exclusive bonus content, exclusive bonus podcasts. Go check that out. We've got some great retrospectives coming up for you very soon. We got Humphrey Bogart. We're going to be reviewing some very well-renowned anime movies. We're also going to finish up the Suspiria series with the Suspiria reimagining coming out in, just a few weeks now. So I'm really looking forward to that. Got a lot of great content coming up for you. Subscribe in the links below to your favorite social media platforms so you can always stay up to date. Once again, listeners, thank you so much for joining us on our Halloween review and retrospective series, and we'll catch you next time.